Yeah, so most of these, I think, so we've got, this is a section on health, which we've got two papers here, yours, Peter, and Dr. Luke Bugaya. I'm going to make a stab at that. So there we are, yes. Yes, yeah. How do you pronounce your name, Luke, your surname?
Buhajar.
Buhajar.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Well done.
Well, it's difficult to imagine the pronunciation when you see it, but when you say it phonetically, it makes perfect sense. And we've got a video presentation, I think, also from Daryl Higgins, Professor Daryl Higgins. But the format of these is going to be, we've got short 15-minute papers. We're going to run them back to back. And then we're going to have a collective session of question and answers. So what I encourage people to do is to, during the papers or afterwards, to write their questions in the Q&A box, which is down the, have we got a Q&A box? No. To write your questions in the chat box so you don't forget them, and then we can come back to them and collect them together. But as I say, this little panel was put together to concentrate on aspects of health and its impact on Catholicism. And we're going to kick off with Dr. Peter Kirvan. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself, Peter? You're from Staffordshire University, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right. I rejoice in the rather pompous title of Professor of Values in Health and Social Care, which is designed not to say very much. And I'm a bit of a vagrant, to be honest. A lot of my work has been done on religious and philosophical issues related to dementia. And more recently, I've been doing more work on the boundary between religious organisations, including Catholic organisations, and social policy. But this is a bit of a side one, actually. This is a bit of a side hustle, and I feel as though I probably ought to start with two apologies. And the first apology is that I'm here at the opening slot of the Health and Wellbeing group of parallel sessions. And I always think that the opening paper should ideally be something fairly typical that will set the tone. So in this case, a piece of practical theology or reflection on the social policy and processes of lived Catholicism. But this particular paper is a rather poor example of the genre, because it has very little empirical work behind it. And it really hardly touches base in lived Catholicism before wandering off in the company of some French philosophers and hopefully coming back again. The second apology that I think I ought to make is that I think that this paper is probably in the wrong part of the conference, since it had nothing much to do with health. And I think the organisers were misled by the mention of suicide in the title, but actually this is mostly to do with adoration. And the title, which some of you may already know, I wouldn't want to patronise you, but the title is actually a line from Teilhard de Chardin from the Milieu Divin, in which he says, "The day is not far distant when humanity will realise that biologically it is faced with a choice between suicide and adoration." And it feels to me that these words took on a new resonance for many of us during lockdown, as we were told to cower in our homes against the fear of the plague stalking our world. And perhaps they come to mind again as we reflect on the closing events of the COP26 summit, as it seemed the leaders of the world had to choose between acknowledging that they were in the grip of powers greater than themselves, or alternatively continuing to pursue nationalist and selfish policies. So these words, I think, point us towards adoration, our hope in adoration. They also, I think, point us to the fact that during lockdown, the opportunities for adoration were pretty curtailed, as churches were closed, services were cancelled, and we were forced, in this country at least, to turn online for opportunities to adore. And among Catholics, of course, most of us, the main recourse was to online masses. And a glance at Church TV, the website, shows how widely this response to the closure of the churches has been adopted, just looking at Great Britain and Ireland. So for many of us, the online mass was a new phenomenon and it took a little getting used to. But it does at least represent, to my mind, a fairly straightforward amalgam of two established devotions. The devotion which comprises the act of attendance at Mass without receiving communion on the one hand, and the practice of receiving communion at home on the other. And it seems to have been quite widely accepted that while an online presence at Mass is far inferior to a physical one, Christ is in some sense present at least by participation in the Word and in the collective work of the people of God, and of course via the act of spiritual communion. I'd love to do a critique of the standard prayers for the act of spiritual communion, but that's for another day. So it makes some sense that Catholics turn to the online Mass as a means of adoration, but it makes rather less sense, at least on the surface, that we also saw a flourishing of the act of adoration of the Blessed Sacrament online. Yet there was a significant rise in this form of devotion also. I did a quick search on YouTube at one point. It was early in July, on the 7th of July. And at that point, I found that there were 87 videos at that moment, live streaming adoration of the sacrament from English-speaking countries. And almost all of those, if not all of them, had started streaming in the preceding 12 months. Online adoration, I think, presents us with a paradox. There is at first glance something intuitively appropriate about adoration during lockdown, something to do with longing for participation in something out of our grasp, for graces that appear to be unavailable to us, something about mourning for a presence in church that we can't have. But in another sense, it seems perverse. If what we long for is the participation in the body of Christ by partaking of his real presence in the Eucharist, then the practice of online adoration represents a multiple removal from the source of our desires. It is an adoration of the sacrament rather than a participation in it. It is adoration at a distance rather than in the same physical space. And it may even be removed in time if the video being viewed is a recording of the sacrament rather than a live stream, as some are. So we begin with a puzzle. Why, if our longing is for participation, may we choose a devotion that has the participatory element removed? And one answer, circulating since the late Middle Ages, but particularly current in the period following Vatican II, is that we're doing this because we are misled, that this is a perversion of devotion into a form of commodity fetishism, substituting the sign of an act of grace for the act itself. And there has been some talk of this in relation to worship during lockdown. An alternative is to understand this devotion as an expression of the sense of fidelium. This represents the current teaching on adoration, which understands that this is indeed an authentic movement of the faithful, although it tends to treat it as a form of pious devotion that acts in a predominantly sentimentalized and psychologized way. The challenge, however, is to take the concept of online adoration with full seriousness and say that perhaps there is more going on here than a matter of mere sentiment, and possibly something which we should at least begin to talk about in terms of a genuine encounter with Christ. So it seems to me that online adoration presents us with three questions worthy of further reflection. Firstly, if the purpose of adoration is to be in physical proximity to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharistic element, what is the attraction of online adoration? Second, why should online adoration ever be preferred to online participation in a Mass, given that online masses are accessible live, almost on demand, at any time of the day or night. And finally, therefore, what is adoration offering distinct from and in addition to online attendance at Mass, if not an opportunity to be in the presence of the body of Christ? Well, taking this just as a contemporary cultural phenomenon, the most obvious tools to investigate the questions are social and anthropological ones. The sort of go-to stuff that I would use would be qualitative interviews or ethnographic methods. But I'm going to put those to one side for the moment because it seems to me that neither of these routes will take us to the heart of the question. For interviews can only yield insights into what people say is motivating them. And as generations of anthropologists have found, Victor Turner springs to mind, post hoc rationalizations that we give for affective ritualized behavior are rarely reliable, and with the best of intentions are likely to be fictions. Ethnographic observation, on the other hand, is of little or no use when there's nothing observable taking place over and above the mere fact that people are engaging in this behavior. So I don't propose to develop my thinking at this stage by using either of these methods. I'm going to start by looking at a sort of theoretical framework in which it might be approached, a sort of prolegomena, if you like, to empirical research. And I'm going to start with one fact and one assumption. Thank you, Marcus. The fact is that some Catholics have found in online adoration a form of devotion that sustains them, and the assumption is that it's not a perversion or dilution of their lived Catholicism, but an authentic expression of it. And then I'm going to follow my notes. To begin then, the default position, of course, for any discussion of sacramental presence is a scholastic one in which real presence resides in the substance of the consecrated host, through which we may encounter the incarnate word in a way analogous to our encounter to a material object in the world. I'm going to shorten this a little because I'm aware of the time factors. So I'm not going to critique that or talk about it much, except to say in passing that understanding of the identification of God with being and with presence came in for some heavy attack in the 20th century, most notably by Martin Heidegger, for whom the whole project of what he called ontotheology cut us off from authentic being and made God unnecessary or incoherent. And although Heidegger's own response to the problem was to abandon interest in God as unnecessary and distracting for Dasein, some of his successors have recently taken up the challenge. In particular, I invoke two Jean-Lucs, Jean-Luc Marion and Jean-Luc Nancy, who have sought to find a way to think of what Marion calls a God beyond being, and what Nancy talks of as an adoration beyond presence. And I want next to touch very briefly on two themes from their respectively appraisals, and to examine whether they help us comprehend online adoration. Jean-Luc Marion then develops an understanding of adoration as an event of engaged and active theology, in which the being that we are encounters the presence of the God beyond being. Our interior prayer, where we are authentically ourselves, meets an external reality in which God is present but not knowable, or at least not yet knowable. As he says, and I quote, "Yet with Eucharistic adoration, a fundamental change takes place, since it is a matter of putting words into the mouth of a reality, if I can put it like this, or of causing the words spoken to be really those said by someone who is here now, before me, infinitely more than me." So to paraphrase, for Marion, adoration is an active process rather than a passive or interiorized one, and this lifts it out of the merely psychological into a process of active participation in the one present in the sacrament. It gives some weight to the magisterial treatment of Eucharistic adoration as a form of popular piety, and casts light on its potential as a way of building a religious world. A contrasting or complementary approach is taken by Jean-Luc Marion, who seeks a way of understanding what he calls the divine while stepping away from the apparatus of religion. This concern undergirds his recent two-volume work, The Deconstruction of Christianity, in which he sees adoration as a process of unknowing of ideas and idioms that no longer work well for us, and an opening to a divine which is not encompassed by our notions of God. Adoration opens a gap in our world of sense-making, a gap in which we encounter the unnameable incarnate. The presence of Christ is not the presence that fills a gap, it is the gap, the disruption that opens up in our world and brings resurrection. God's presence is known as an absence of other presences, other sense of our own self-integrity. So what can be learned from our experience of adoration in lockdown? Well, about 2 years ago, a survey was published in the USA that concluded that 69% of US Catholics do not believe in the real presence of Christ in the consecrated elements. The poll is deeply flawed, and it almost certainly gives badly skewed results. It is also being used by the conservative wing of the Church as a stick to beat what they consider to be modernizers, most recently with the emerging Eucharistic document. The response of the US Conference of Catholic Bishops has been to diagnose the problem as a lack of education and an attempt to restate traditional teaching, with the hope presumably of a better poll result next time. In the light of my observations above, I suspect that the bishops may be heading in the wrong direction. The problem is not that US Catholics have ceased to believe in the presence of Christ in the sacrament, but that presence itself has come to mean something different in popular piety to what the bishops expect it to mean, and therefore construct the questions around. The experience of lockdown has forced many of us to seek out sacramental presence in the midst of a physical absence of sacraments, and to find it in ways that resemble more the accounts of adoration in the two French philosophers I have briefly surveyed than in classical formulae. So the next step, I think, to understand this better will be to attempt a deeper dive and a theoretically informed dive into what people say is going on for them as they access active adoration online, and to bring it into critical conversation with some of the theoretical insights on the possibilities of sacramental faith, quote, after metaphysics, that are coming from continental philosophy. My hope is that this deeper insight may provide us with new ways to think about the Catholic of sacramentality at a time when our world of social transactions is increasingly becoming a hybrid of physical and online spaces. Am I in time, Marcus?
We are 51, so effectively you're a minute over time.
I'm a minute over time, okay.
Is that you finished then, Peter?
That's me done then, yes.
Well, thank you for that. Absolutely wonderful, and picks up actually on some of the, particularly the continental philosophical themes, sort of picking up on some of the stuff that, some of the ground covered by Massimo as well, and his sort of sense of paradox. I particularly like the problematic of how you study people studying the adoring the Mass, and it's like you need the equivalent of Google or something for Catholics to set up some cameras. But we'll return a little later, and I'm hoping people are going to put up some questions in the chat later for Peter's paper. But we're going to move to Luke Bugaya. He's going to say it much nicer than me because it's his name.
Thank you, Marcus. Right, so I'm Luke Bugaya, and basically I am Chief Research Officer at the CERN, a research institute within the Archdiocese of Malta, and part-time lecturer at the University of Malta. And I'll be presenting work together with Matthew Police, who is here as well, and Andrea Zaffarese, concerning the effects of COVID-19 on parishes. Let me see if I can share because I have a presentation. I don't know. I think I need permission to share.
Right, Martin. You've got a recorded presentation, have you?
I have slides. I can.
Right. Let's just see if we can. You're not able to share those slides, is that right?
It's disabled. I think it has to be enabled from the host.
Right. 2 ticks, Luke.
Luke, I think if I may, you should be able to share your screen. If you could bring them up on your
Okay, now it's
screen.
great. Yeah.
So there's a share screen in the bottom in the toolbar there.
Yes. Okay, now it's available. Thank you. So can you see the PowerPoint?
Brilliant.
Okay, great. Right, so let me start with a bit of an introduction. Then I'll go to the sort of the Maltese context and then Catholicism in Malta, and then I'll go on to the methodology behind the study. This was a qualitative study involving semi-structured interviews and based in the practice of the social sciences, and then onto the findings and some conclusions perhaps from these findings. So in Malta, there are about 70 parishes centered around particular different localities. So the Maltese islands are small islands. There's the Archdiocese of Malta, and this is the one that I will be speaking of in this study. About, depending on which surveys you consult, around 80% of the population would identify as Catholics, with some differences as to what that would mean when you delve deeper into that label. And recent census showed that about 35% of the population attend Mass. Pretty homogeneous population, with only 18% being foreign nationals. And in terms of COVID-19, the church is closed in March 2020 and reopened in June 2020. And that's important in that in the study that we conducted, basically between December and February 2021, we asked different parish priests and pastoral workers about their views on the effects of COVID-19 on spiritual life, on the church, what they think the priorities should be, what they think how they think the most vulnerable were hit by COVID-19, etc., etc. Right, and I just like to say also in terms of the culture in Malta, the parish priest tends to have many different roles, even administrative roles, ranging from the more mundane, perhaps, in terms of distributing food to people in need, all the way to more formal duties, and even sometimes organizing the village feasts, which are very popular in Malta, etc., etc. So it's a very eclectic role, the role of the parish priest here. And what we did was basically semi-structured interview, so with some questions prepared beforehand, but also allowing the participants to elaborate as they deemed fit, with 8 parish priests and 10 pastoral workers of different experiences and backgrounds, usually from the same parish, with a few exceptions, with about 2 exceptions, where one parish priest was from a parish not represented by a pastoral worker, and vice versa. And in terms of sampling, there was a subjective element, but we tried to go for maximum variation to get the different views in terms of locality, the size of the locality, the culture of the region of the island there, and also the parish priest leadership culture, as discussed, and sort of looking at the combination of these 4 to sample. And we analyzed the data using thematic analysis inspired by Attrid Stirling's thematic network, where basically the idea is to segment the data into, essentially, to put it very simply, 3 different levels, from the global to the organizing to the basic themes, and at every level of analysis there are themes that are emerging. And I'll be, first of all, displaying some of the main themes which concerned the parish identity, the philosophy that people spoke of in terms of where the church should be headed, how Catholicism should be lived, etc. And also the future of parishes, as you can see. As you can see here, I don't know if it's large enough, but essentially the 3 different global themes that emerged from the study were to do with parish work and identity, the philosophies associated, so people's views on COVID-19's effects on the church, but what it means philosophically in terms of which orientation to take, which direction to take, both spiritually and even beyond. And the future of the parishes, both in terms of immediate parish priorities because of COVID-19 and, say, in 5 years' time and in the future. Something interesting about in this interview, something that's characteristic of really all qualitative interviews perhaps, is that participants would elaborate over and above the questions asked, which is great. We're human, and you can't be, regardless of what us social scientists try to do, to categorize people. But that was great because, in a sense, it gave the data a forward-looking orientation, right? So it enabled something striking was that 5 different patterns emerged concerning lay identities, diaconia, spirituality, and mass, and also parish professionalization that were quite there, about which there were quite similar convergences across the parish priests and the pastoral workers, which are what I'll be speaking about today in terms of the findings now. So the first pattern that really emerged was the idea of people desiring a bit of what some termed as an ecclesiological shift towards the church as more of a living community. So rather than the priest having more authority, more of a bottom-up approach towards the church and church life. And this dichotomy between lay people being conceived as mere helpers within parish life versus more active parishioners, which is a dilemma or a polemic that is discussed in Catholic circles locally. And also an emphasis on investing in active future laity. So to quote one of the participants, who in this case was a parish priest, he said, "You need a pastoral work that involves the lay. We lost a number of valid persons because we either paid them peanuts or we took their evenings, poor souls. So we need to invest in pastoral agents. Look at other works, for example, administrative ones, that we do have resources for, but only for that. Pastoral work with children, school chaplaincy work with youth, that is all extremely important." Here, the convergence was not necessarily on the resource sides of things, that's more the perhaps personal view, take on the matter, but the need for pastoral work where the lay are given more importance. And this was spurred by considerations in terms of lived Catholicism, but specifically because of the effects of the pandemic. In terms of diaconia, diaconia was construed in different manners that stood out during the pandemic, all the way ranging from pastoral presence to diaconia as a form of evangelization more directly. But something that really stood out was the idea of targeting diaconia. So whereas prior to COVID-19, perhaps helping those in need was something that was taken more for granted in terms of the method, perhaps, not by everyone, and one could challenge that, but there was more of a general sense, even from the participants' replies, that because of the pandemic, this idea of specifying different needs of different migrants with different backgrounds, catering to different people's socioeconomic status, etc., when providing help was seen as being more important, including the need for research to help in this approach. There was also a lot of appreciation of the work that was done, so an appreciation of COVID-19 bringing the best out of people in some scenarios as well. So these two quotes here mentioning help by Caritas and commissions having to do with diaconia in Malta, and also the fact that meetings were more fruitful in some aspects because of the pandemic. There's also the sentiment, so if we look at the second quote by a pastoral worker, there was also the sentiment that, in this participant's words, "I believe that our parish is not yet attuned to the true new needs of the parish, to the foreigners living amongst us. We only know of the elderly living in the parish. We know those who frequent our church, but we do not know the people at the periphery of the parish." So there is a sense of a desire to know more about the new what participants perceive as being the new realities of the parish. In terms of spiritual needs and effects, there was a balance in terms of the positive and negative effects as seen by participants. What converged across participants generally was an appreciation of hybridity, online-offline hybridity, and a sense of taking this forward. Now, a question that comes to mind even from the talk previous to this one, mentioning Victor Turner, was whether this approximates sort of a bit of a liminal phase and ideations and sort of thoughts that one would have in an in-between phase, or whether this would really remain the sentiment going forward in terms of retaining hybridity. But from the interviews, there was a general appreciation of technology as a new geography that Catholics in Malta should really navigate, instead of seeing merely as a tool that may or may not be used, as was the case prior to the pandemic. In terms of the Mass and sacraments, something that came across all the three themes in terms of philosophies, the future of parishes, and also the parish's work and identity, was what some termed as the quality-quantity dilemma, in terms of a lot of worry about people not attending Mass due to COVID-19, but a counter-argument saying that that might not be a bad idea to focus more on needs and sort of forming people in Christian formation who would like that, and not forming others who would not want to. So these are perhaps the challenges or dilemmas of a country with a majority Catholic population, where, for example, with recent surveys in terms of youth between the 18 and 25 years old, the demographics seem to be 80% Catholic, 16% no religion, and then a few other religions like Islam, Christian, non-Catholic, etc. So it's this dichotomy that people are speaking about because of this backdrop of being either Catholic or no religion, which tends to be the majority divide in the Maltese context. There are also different attributions for the lack of participation. So people attributing their own lived experience of as being Catholics to others, saying either that others thirsted for the Eucharist during COVID-19 or else experienced a level of spiritual dryness or else a lack of interest as well. So there were these different sort of introspective attributions made to the co-parishioners. But what converged here across the participants was this idea of focusing on the numbers or the persons. And the final point, point that sort of stood out across the three themes, which I'm speaking about today, was the need to professionalize parishes. So this was something where, for the first time, or in recent time, for something that started to emerge, was parishes lacking a sufficient number of volunteers, which was exacerbated by the pandemic. Parishes where volunteers themselves wanted for better role definition of what they're doing, etc. So these ideas where parish priests and the pastoral workers converged had to do with finding ways of professionalizing different aspects of the parishes, for example, in terms of software used and in terms of moving toward a professional volunteer model. In conclusion, even when these results were presented locally to different members of the church active in the Catholic Church, there were 5 points that sort of were discussed more fully in terms of what perhaps should be done, but more as points of reflection, sort of viewing the pandemic as sparing discussion on how to strengthen lay voices, considering even the relation, given that this is a majority Catholic country, considering lay relations with non-Catholics in the parish and how to be of service to them, even on their own terms, instead of trying to perhaps sell new ideas, which would they perceive as being new ideas. And also an ecclesiological shift perhaps towards a church as a more of a bottom-up church. The third point that was discussed was how to take hybridity forward, the quality-quantity dilemma, and more importantly, perhaps how to professionalize parishes. So in terms of lived experience, one can say that COVID-19, and even the general sense here is that COVID-19 sort of made salient points that were already there. An open question remains, and this could be a matter for future research, whether this is a bit of a liminal phase or whether these are long-standing structural and bottom-up changes that we're observing. So that, I think, would be the main question in terms of the social science and the anthropology of lived Catholicism going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Luke. That was really interesting, and that metaphor of the new spatial geography that the internet sort of provides helps actually make a nice link with Peter's paper, I thought. Yeah, no, that was really wonderful. Now, next up we've got Daryl Higgins, who I believe is not actually here, but I believe Martin. Martin, you are technical host, aren't you? Hello, Martin. Can you hear us? Martin's going to be putting on the video presentation. Hello, Martin. Attention. Martin, ready for begins. Please. I think of course the beauty of this is if this all goes wrong is we get more time on the other two papers. Yeah, no, I will just say briefly, Luke, I mean, it's a really interesting question, Matt, about whether that's a liminal experience or we often hear of this is the new normal in the light of COVID, or are we going back to the normal? And what strikes me in all of this is that thing that actually, as Marshall McLuhan said, you know, the medium is the message. We're not just using these unideological tools to help us do something. They actually change the whole nature of that. And understanding that is really quite crucial to the ongoing thinking. Are you there, Martin, yet? Have we got Daryl Higgins' video? Nope. What I'm going to do is I have his telephone number, so I'm just going to ring him quickly. In the meantime, can I suggest that we just start to think of some questions for Peter and Luke, just in case this doesn't pull off? And I invite those from all the people listening here. Have to shuffle off to Clark. Oh no, that's right. That's from Hector Valeria. Okay, well, as we can't seem to, oh right, Hector, you're off, are you? Right, thanks for that. As we can't seem to access Daryl Higgins' paper quite yet, can I suggest then that we put some questions to Luke or Peter?
Sorry, I'm just jumping on there. Did we have are we expecting a video submission from Daryl?
I think we were. Is there not one?
Just bear with me 1 sec. I'll see if there is one. Just hold 1 second.
Yeah.
No, I've received a Word document from him. So I don't know, maybe he's thinking somebody would read that out. Would you like me to pop that over to you?
Pop it over to me.
I will do that to you on email, Marcus.
Righty-ho. Well, I suspect that really what we should do is we should just chitty-chat about those previous two papers, as we've got a nice amount of time. So give that 3 seconds.
Right, that is on its way to you on email, Marcus. So just give it a few seconds to work its way through the ether.
Right, there it is. Yes, here we are. And yep, that is open. Right. So looks like I'll be doing Daryl Higgins' presentation, which is okay by me. I've got some sense of what he's talking and his research is about. Here we are. Right, I'm just going to have a quick look at this. Right, look, what I'm going to say is that because he's not here, I thought he was going to provide a video. I think it'd be a bit boring if I just read it out to you. I think it'd be a bit contextless. So I'm going to open up the remaining amount of this time. I'll make an executive decision to questions from Luke and Peter, if that's all right. Are you there, Peter? Hello, Peter.
Sorry, it takes a while to unmute, but yes, I'm here. I'll put my camera on now as well.
That's great. So we had two papers there. There was a sense of overlap, I thought, in that both were contending with different aspects of Catholicism. One, adoration by Peter, and the difference that the online adoration of the Eucharist in the light of COVID had made to traditional understandings of presence, for example, and Luke's paper on the effects of COVID on a parish with a more sort of, I would say, more concerted sort of methodology of interviews, but also throwing up some of those issues about how the web introduces new modes of navigating, that nice metaphor of a new sort of spatial temper as well, because time is is a key factor. The very fact that some people can meet 3 times a week instead of 3 times a month. I think we've experienced that in our professional lives, but it makes a difference to parish life also. So can I invite some questions from the floor, please? Oh, yes. Peter Collins, brilliant.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, right. Well, I should start by saying that I should be a bit timid in terms of posing questions or making comments in the company that I'm in here this afternoon, because I'm highly underqualified. I'm an ordained deacon, permanent deacon, but I'm a scientist, a technologist by background rather than a theologian. Just coming back, it just struck me, the early, this is a reflection rather than a question, and it's probably not a good place to start really, but with our plenary talk on paradox, it seems to me that and reflecting on Peter's really lovely talk there about online adoration in the Eucharist. I mean, I think before we even start to address that, we've got a whole paradox to explore in terms of our understanding of the real presence and our understanding of what we're doing when we kneel before the Blessed Sacrament in church, never mind doing it online. And I suppose I do that myself personally from time to time, and I do that at times in leading a group of people in doing that. And I do that with great uncertainty as what I'm really doing when I'm doing that, if that makes any sense to anybody. And without getting too heretical, I consider myself, I suppose, using that Blessed Sacrament as a channel of grace, as a way of allowing God to speak in my heart, in God's presence. And I suppose where I'm coming to with this is, at the end of the day, if that works for you online as a person, then I think that's a perfectly good thing to be doing. It may not be, it may not meet all the rigors and everything else that the church might want to impose, but I actually think, in a sense, adoration of the Blessed Sacrament is a very, if you like, a very refined form of prayer, or a very particular form of prayer. And if prayer is that opening that channel of communication between yourself and God, or allowing yourself to be open to God to speak to you, then I think that if that works for you online, I think that's a really valid and fine thing to do. I'll shut up at that, but I think those just be my observations on all this. If it works, good stuff. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I'm absolutely with you. I mean, the starting point of the paper was precisely that if this is what people are doing, then we start on the assumption that it's a valid expression of Catholicism, because we start with the sensus fidelium. So I'm absolutely with you on that. It reminded me actually of something that Karl Rahner said about the Immaculate Conception. I can't remember where it is, where he basically said this is a situation where the sensus fidelium won. The magisterium weren't particularly keen on the Immaculate Conception. They could see all sorts of theological problems with it, but the people just said, this is the truth we're living, and so they won. And if it came to it, I think I'd go the same with online adoration, that if people are doing this, then it's because it's working for them. I guess for me, it points up some. When I start thinking about space in relation to sacramentality, I think it starts to get really interesting in my head. It's not necessarily interesting for anybody else. For example, we would say that sort of real adoration of the sacrament is to be physically present. Does it matter how close you are? Does it matter whether you can see it? Is it through a wall? So at that level, it already monkeys with space. The concept of sacramentality monkeys with space anyway. As the sort of early Christians found out, the they very quickly started getting critiques of sort of, well, how can Jesus be in so many different places at once in the body? So it's already monkeying with that, and move to online in that sense just intensifies a sort of theological, I was going to say theological problem with space, a sort of theological richness with thinking about what spaces are, that we've already got. And I suppose just sort of pushing that one a little bit further into Luke's territory, really, about what will be the space of worship in the future. You know, at a time when Facebook has just turned itself into Meta, and it's talking about sort of how a virtual world could be as salient and important to us as a physical one, then what is the space within which Christ is present, if we assume that the presence and space have something to do with each other? And do virtual spaces do that for us? And I guess most of us would say, well, yeah, the fullness of a mass is when we're physically together in the same space. But I wonder why we say that, and how we then negotiate our increasing move into virtual spaces.
Is there not something, I don't know, incarnational that's at the heart of our faith? You know, that the Word became flesh. That there is a sense of a need for materiality as well as spirituality to our faith. You know, that Jesus was God become man, and true God and true man. That paradox that we hold. And I've often wondered, you know, kind of what was going on, you know, where Jesus was God spatially located at a place, at a point in time, you know, be it in Nazareth, be it in Galilee, be it wherever. And how does that materialization of God, in a sense that we have in Jesus, you know, how do we begin even to get our heads around what was going on there with Jesus talking to his Father, with Jesus, you know, and we start to get into all sorts of ideas of high Christology, of foreknowledge and so forth, all that kind of stuff. But then, as you say afterwards, you know, for the early Christian church, for the apostles, you know, and in the post-resurrection appearances, trying to understand this idea of Jesus in Jerusalem, Jesus in Galilee, and yeah, I mean, it's just mind-blowing. And you know, on the other hand, somebody once in the course, I guess it was Tom O'Loughlin, I think, I heard him say something like, you know, you can't get an apple on IT. and this followed by somebody else saying you can't do dentistry online. And you know, there is a sense in which I think there is a paradox there between materiality and spirituality. But hey, what do you think, chaps?
Well, can I just jump in there? In fact, thank you for that sort of clarification, Peter. I mean, I was reminded of two things. Firstly, I was reminded of an incident in a Catholic church where the priest had a list of names on the wall, and they were to do with remembering the dead. And I was asking him about the mechanics of it. And he was saying, well, it's quite simple. You know, a family give us some money to, say, a mass for the dead. And of course, what with inflation and all of that, what he said was, well, what we do is we invest the money. And so as long as the investments are making a return, we can still save a mass for the dead. But it's lovely, the fragility of that relationship between the most spiritual and, in a sense, the most material. Something that Hegel sort of picks up on when he talks of, you know, if you look inside for the spirit of man, what you actually find is bone. And so, again, it comes back to this theme. But I was also reminded of the paper by Massimo and the reference to de Lubac, because, of course, part of his argument was that if you divorce nature from grace, then grace becomes something that can be localized as a power within the clerical class. And that, so that, you know, and you can see a variant of that in sort of Protestant healing ceremonies, the touching of hands, the laying on, when you can only imagine that somehow the power has to come through the priest. I reckon it comes down the arm. and then into the person's head. You know, these models of presence and how we operate them say also a lot about power too. So what I was interested in Peter's point, which reminded me of Carl Jung. He said the same as Rana about the assumption of Mary, but you know, this was the sort of, you know, the Catholic collective responding to the lack of the feminine within Catholicism, and a kind of census fidei, not quite, but sort of. So one of the things that this new spatial geography has, you know, I mean, I think we have to live with those paradoxes, but it has introduced these different configurations of power. So, for example, for some women, and I don't know how well women are represented amongst this group here, but for some women that I've been sort of talking to about this phenomena, it represents a chance to experience something of the Mass and the Eucharist through the adoration, but without the trappings of masculine power. Whereas I've heard other women speak the opposite, that it actually ingrains a more concerted sense of authority and control. So I think there's a lot to pick out of there. Sorry, Pete, did you want to?
No, I mean, that's thank you for that, and that was timely, I think. But I suppose the other thing I was going to say, Peter, was actually in relation to Martin's response to Massimo, that something about the binaries, that I'm not sure that saying we have a physical world and a virtual world, and one of them just does spirit and the other does spirit and body, quite covers it, and that the physicality of the risen Christ is to say the least paradoxical, as you yourself pointed out. So it's not as simple as saying you can't do dentistry on the internet. There's something more about physicality in the theological frame than that, but I don't know what that would be. I really only threw that out to
polarized thinking, because you know, there is that tremendous paradox in the resurrected Christ of, you know, walks through walls and eats fish. I mean, I don't have a clue what's going on there. I don't know if anybody else has, but I don't have a clue, you know, how our good Lord does that. But I'm quite happy to hold that as a paradox, that may be possible.
Oh, you wanted to come in here?
Sure.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the issue that Peter raised in a friendly way.
Which one?
So I thought of the iconoclasm debates, right? So can you have an image, and does the image actually serve a purpose, or can it convey a sense of presence? And I think there's a very close parallel between digital presentation and presence and some of the underlying theological issues, you know, from the 6th, 7th century debates over icons. So I think there is a way, I mean, because it's digital, right? So if you can see it, like, you know, in the iconoclasm debate, if you can see it, you know, it's physical. And so I can see you, even though it's not like seeing you in person, you're still present here. And so it may be, I don't have strong feelings one way or the other, but it may be that this is a perfectly fine way for people to interact and have a sense of presence. And that's all I have to say.
Yeah, it's a very interesting one, isn't it? And sorry, this is a bit divergent, but I have a nephew who is on the autism spectrum. And when he was younger, he was very into a computer game, well, really a computer world called Final Fantasy. I don't know if you've heard of it, but you create your own character within that. And he created a female character for himself. And he had a friend within Final Fantasy who also had a female character, and the two of them got married in Final Fantasy. And then eventually he got dumped his character got dumped by this character. And they had a divorce, and he was completely heartbroken about it. And you think, what's going on here? I mean, neither of them were their real selves in that sense. And yet the grief was real. And how do you respond to that? So if you're responding to the presence of an other online with that sort of intensity of emotion, you have to either say, well, that's completely false, that's completely misplaced, or you have to say, no, there's some kind, within those representations, there is enough of the original person there for you to authentically be loving them. I'm not sure if that takes us anywhere. It's just something that's bothering me right now.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there is that book by Jean Baudrillard, Simulation, which I think the first chapter of that starts off with precisely a discussion about the iconoclastic debate in the context of the new virtual world, which, relatively speaking, would have been quite compared to what we experience today of the web. I should think Baudrillard's experience would have been quite limited. But
Yes,
nonetheless,
late 90s, wasn't he?
That's right. But nonetheless, he picks up precisely on this iconoclastic, iconic debate. And in the context of the discussion of hyperreality, that might prove a sort of fruitful sort of way into that. I'm reminded also, we've got a question from Matthew, but I can't resist saying also there's a nice essay by Umberto Eco, which was written also probably sometime in the late 80s on the difference between Macs and Apples. With Apples, he argued, were Catholic, and that's right, and PCs, Microsoft, were Protestant, precisely because the Apple, in its initial incarnation, excuse me, theological overtones, used icons as a way of navigating the screen in contrast to the PC. So actually, even in the way these computers have developed, perhaps there's also subtle modelings by religious thought. But Matthew, to bring us back to something far more serious.
I was going to add with what Peter was saying. I mean, very often we still think, especially us millennials and upwards, we still think about using the internet or going online, entering into the realm of games and whatnot. But if we backtrack and try to see how a digital native would think, where there's no kind of going online, but they live in a hyper digital culture, I think when we start looking at reality through that mindset, all this question whether digital sacraments can or are a thing, I think they start collapsing, to be honest, because all this fixation on the physical, I think it's a bit outdated today. So I don't know if I'm actually putting more ingredients in this.
Well, I guess the question is how in the outdatedness of that physicality, and this is a question for sort of both Luke and Peter, perhaps Luke, excuse me, how in the light of that failure, how we rethink these central categories.
Right. I'm still thinking about, I believe it was Victor Turner that Peter mentioned at some point, right?
Yeah.
With post hoc rationalization. I'm still going back to the idea of liminality, especially as he had described it in his 1977 Variations on a Theme of Liminality. The fact that we're still trying to see what the boundaries are, the amorphousness of it all, the lack of definition, even when the online is being policed or when it's not, seems to indicate that this could be a liminal phase. Now, I mean, the concept of liminality as a form of in-betweenness and someone that goes through a rite of passage, and there's the liminal phase and then a threshold where you're finally reintegrated into society, right? But in terms of the literature, I'm seeing this concept in management, in HR, in terms of career. It's being applied to individuals and to whole communities, sort of being used and abused almost. But I'm still going back to that concept because the policing sometimes of whether online is good or not, or whether it would be the future or not, and the vagueness associated with that seems to me to indicate that this could be a transitory period. But whether it is transitory or not, it must be gone through in a sense. So whether it is transitory or not, there will be adoration online and there will be experiences and articulations of it and communities forming around it. So I think the challenge ultimately will be how, not whether communities will eventually form based at least partly on this, but how to continue dialogue once certain splits happen, almost. Now, my background is in intergroup relations and social psychology, so maybe that is where I'm coming from. Not to sort of take a conflict approach to this, but I think that should be almost the question. So whether it is a transitory phase or not, we don't know. But whichever the answer may be, there needs to be an articulation of it as if it were not. That's, I think, what.
Yeah.
In terms of outdatedness or not, yeah.
One of the things that strikes me about the World Wide Web and its creation and what is offered, and again, picking up on Massimo's paper and his reference to transparency, is that in a strange way, the idea of presence underpins the whole notion of the web, that it can deliver all knowledge to you instantly, wherever you are. We've all been fact-checked in a conversation, usually by somebody slightly younger with a more expensive phone than we could afford. But, so even these theological ideas of presence that have sort of and we should eventually, thinking about this question of limitality, surely the limitations to presence that we encounter in the shift to adoration will hopefully maybe be met in the limitations of presence that the myth of the web will actually deliver in some senses. So it's difficult to say, but what I can tell you from the English experience, Luke, is that, I mean, I thought the sexual abuse, the phenomena of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church in England, which has, I mean, it's certainly impacted to some degree, but it has not impacted on church going as much as the reorganization of parishes around clusters, which changes mass times. And that's partly because the mentality of the hierarchy in this country is very much towards that sense of the mass, the obligation on Sunday. I mean, most young people don't live a sort of that kind of weekday anyway. That going mass time has the biggest effect on whether people continue going or not. I think that's my hunch, but I'll leave that to experts rather than conjecture. Peter,
could I just pick up could I pick up on the liminality thing? Because the more I think about it, the more I think this is quite important. That of course, the period of the pandemic has to have been a liminal period, in the sense that we literally went apart from our communities into separate places, and literally lived under different conditions for a liminal period before re-emerging to a world that was the same and yet somehow different. So in that sense, it fits very precisely the Van Gennep rites of passage idea. And I suppose the question there, the two questions that I would bring out of that are, how much of a genuine change has that made to our society? We are seeing changes in things like working patterns, which look as though they're going to be lasting now. And then the next question in there is, as you say, new communities form, as new ways of expressing lived Catholicism form, will they still be recognizably Catholic, and will the institution have changed alongside them? And the problem is that I don't think that we will ever be able to determine that except with hindsight, because we don't ourselves know what the immediate future looks like, far less how to respond to it.
Matthew.
And Luke, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's something which we found in our data as well. Now that the institution, the parish priests are more ready to go back to the old system, whereas the parishioners are looking to adopt a new stage, a new mindset.
Yeah, indeed, especially those who are more metrics savvy, sort of in terms of seeing who is online, etc. But to link this perhaps to Peter's observation, though, something that is also at the back of my mind is, could there be a precarity to the digital in the sense with COP26, right? We're taking the online as a geography that is sort of okay, stable, unstable, but it's there. But the moment fossil fuels run out, and if there aren't any renewables that are working well, etc., etc., and if we don't fix this, that geography will switch off. So it's like sometimes I'm thinking in terms of trying to take a bird's eye view to all this. It becomes a bit of a weird geography, a very almost uncanny. Not that I don't like it, or it's not that I'm fully of course we're online, so I must be participating in it. But yeah, it's there's a liminal element. There's a divide in terms of reception or reaction, and there's a geography that could perhaps be a bit flimsy sometimes. But yeah.
Peter, did you have got your hand up there?
Again, just a comment, really. I mean, picking up on Luke's, I thought, really, really well made point there about, is this transitory or not? And I think, we are exactly as Peter and Luke were both saying, we are in this liminal, well, we've been and still are, I think, in this liminal place, and we're trying to emerge from, and do we emerge in this direction or do we emerge in that direction? And I think exactly as Luke was, if I'm understanding you correctly, Luke, this idea that many of our parish priests are kind of harking almost to go back to where we were. Looking in my own parish, we've had online YouTube masses available, since very early on in lockdown here in the UK. We started probably March, April time kind of thing, straight after the lockdown. Very simply, very cheaply done, webcam and laptop, open software and away, and at one point, our parish, we've got a joint parish, it's not that big, but on Trinity Sunday we had 500 views of Mass. And we don't have that many people in our parish, and yet now our parish priest is saying, I think we'll just have online stream masses twice a month rather than every week. And one or two people already started saying to me, but I couldn't get to Mass last week. We've been in isolation for COVID, or they're okay, but they're in isolation. Somebody else who lives in another part of the country who's moved away from our parish says, yeah, but through online Mass, I can feel part of our parish family, our parish community. So you got all those, and it just strikes me as well that we won't know exactly as you say, Luke, which direction we're going to come out of this in. But I do think the church really needs to put some serious resources into understanding the best available technology for delivering this kind of experience, to make the whole, to make our online Eucharist not just TV programs, but to make them opportunities for interaction, just like we're having now, where we can talk and comment and bring people in, and have lay people participating to do the readings, have tea and coffee after Mass online, so that people can meet in online communities and find the best technology for that. And there's some serious money needs to be spent on figuring out, okay, do stuff at the lowest level, but then figure out what's the best way and come up with some ideas and suggestions for doing that. I think. I don't know, what do you guys think?
Well, I'm reminded, Peter, that the Vatican has long sort of run a sort of broadcast TV service. And in fact, if you watched particularly the Christmas Mass, if you watched the Christmas Mass and went to confession, you were sort of given like a sort of general absolution just by virtue of, the condition. Interestingly, the condition of that was not that you just watched it, but you had to actually go and have a confession as well. So they retained a sort of physical portion to it. But nonetheless, even then, the idea that you could receive absolution across the TV screen, I mean, that was, when I first sort of experienced that, I thought that was quite radical. I mean, but the stuff we're in, and, so there is a precedence for kind of thinking through that. And admittedly, that was aimed much more towards the elderly. Two Peters there, Peter Curban and then Peter Collins.
I was just picking up, really following on from what you were saying, that when Pope Francis gave the it was sort of an out of time Urbi et Orbi blessing from Vatican Square, St. Peter's Square. That I hadn't thought of this before, but somebody else put me onto this, that it's only the Pope really who can give a blessing to the whole world in benediction. So every other priest can give a benediction to the people in the church, or I think there was one who did it from the roof of the church, I seem to remember, during lockdown, to the area, but the Pope can actually give a blessing to the whole world. And so there's one attends that blessing only online or over TV, I think, and have done so for a long time. So there's as you say, there are precedents for this.
Peter, Peter Collins, we've just got 1 minute left.
So I put my hand down. I put my hand down. I was just finished on that. I mean, my observation from that will be as well that, if you like, listening to what Peter's just said, Pope Francis is probably one of the only religious leaders in the world who can give a blessing to the whole world and have many people, even outside his own denomination, wanting to accept and receive that blessing. I mean, the impact of Francis walking those steps at the peak of the pandemic there, and walking up to St. Peter's Basilica to come and turning out to give that blessing to the world. That was really powerful stuff that was going on there. And you know, lots of non-Catholics have said exactly that to me, that wow, yeah, something special.
I always thought the image of St. John Paul II sort of suffering dementia so publicly as well, which was another really powerful use of the medium. Anyway, we are out of time now, but I think it's real testimony to Luke and Peter's work that they've stimulated such a vibrant conversation. I mean, I personally found that absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure I will speak for everybody else. So big round of silent virtual applause for Peter and Luke. And hopefully we'll get to join you. There we go. Hopefully, great. Hopefully we'll get to join you in the conversation later. Good. There were some women in the group. Fantastic, even better. Right. Okay, so I think the program says we've got some time. Go away and do something. Go and do some adoration or something like that if you can. 3 minutes or whenever. And then the next session, I believe, is at 5 o'clock, and that's with Michelle Dillon, who has written quite a stunning book some time ago on how we negotiate post-secular life. Not just secular versus belief, but the post-secular. So I'm sure that'll be close to many people's hearts here, the paradoxes that presents. Okay, so many thanks for that. Bye-bye.